Origin of the popular Finessed spot. Jupiter is the god of all gods, king of all kings in Roman times, in a millennium. Even more than that, good and evil is in a fight. Enemies will battle enemies for land, but sometimes different land, a land greater. In a fatigued mood, Jupiter sat on his throne, his hand to his chin in a slightly aggravated mood, but he did not know the reason of this mood. Still, Jupiter was fatigued on a plethora amount of levels. Then in the late evening, he went outside of his castle into the dusk, and looked up at the stars and was astounded by the wonder of this sight. Then he saw one that was amazingly beautiful. He knew greatness could come of it, but how, he thought. He saw its beauty and its wonderfulness, then looked much closer into the universe and saw that it had a magnificent golden, yellow, and white color on it. But those singular complexions, so he thought, it needed unique tones. But he wanted to keep this sight towards himself, to never let anybody else see it. Then, after a few years, then to say the facts about it and become rich. But then he saw it with even more detail. He broke 3 of roadblocks from his regular sight, but it was only yellow and white. He thought it would be good if it had more look to it. But first the name. What name would it be? How about after himself? Jupiter would be its designation. He looked even deeper in the celestial sky of Earth's atmosphere. He waited for something to occur, just to change his life. In the subsequent day, it became dark as pitch. And the more that Jupiter looked at the prodigious figure in the sky, the more he was disgusted by its look. But how could he disable its look, he thought? He didn't visualize anything until daybreak. But then, light bulbs popped over his head. To give it some finesse, he put some blue on it. But how much? But where should it be? But why should it be there? But how could it get blue? All the inquiries he would create, the worse his likings of Jupiter he would have. Jupiter always was a perfectionist and stayed that way, so he needed perfection. Nonetheless, it seemed impossible. Jupiter was determined to undertake this accomplishment, but his people would know that there is another planet out there after Earth. Just then, Jupiter's worst enemy, Mercury, showed up. Mercury acted as if he was so perfect and Jupiter disliked it very much. "What do you happen to be doing?" he asked in a smirk type of smile. "I happen to be looking at the stars in space," he said in a rather guilty accent of choice. But Mercury just had to know exactly what he was doing, just so he could ruin it for him like always. But just as Jupiter was going to say something, he jumped onto his chariot and steered it into space. As he got into his chariot, and as he was in outer space, he aimed for his new planet, Jupiter. Just as Mercury had flown into celestial space, he saw that the ghastly planet as well, and like Jupiter, Mercury had become a greedy person. But he thought about killing Jupiter and taking the glory. But would he really get the glory from killing the High King, the highest of all? So he thought they could make a deal. But what kind of deal, he thought? They fought while in conversation. "I have a deal to make with you," Mercury shouted furiously. "What is it?" "We share the giant planet in peace." "Why shall I?" Because why? To become friends and fight together as allies. Then Jupiter realized that Mercury was bribing him into cheating and lying, just to trick him later on. Mercury was a brighter leader than some would think. Luckily, he took action. "Never!" he shouted in furious motion, and with all his might. Then he drew his might and used his strength to fight for his planet. He then felt a change in his mind, not for greed, not for glory, but for peace. But he knew that only path to peace is war. So he had to fight to give Jupiter to other people of the mythological Roman Empire. Jupiter came up as quick as lightning and struck his sword on Mercury. But Mercury was quick and fast with agile speed. He came up as Mercury dodged Jupiter's strike and then hit him hard enough that he went to the ground, nearly unable to get up. He lay on the ground. puny god, Mercury said with disgust in his visage. Just then, Jupiter used his leg to somehow trip Mercury as he was walking. Then he fell on the gaseous surface of this planet. Jupiter saw that the fall created blood to appear on Mercury's face. So then, Jupiter got up quicker than lightning and drew his sword once more. Then, with mighty power, Jupiter thrusted his sword into Mercury's body with a loud "Eeah!" from Jupiter. So, in the later years, Jupiter was then able to have his newly discovered planet. Some say that this spot is a storm that has been functioning for 400 years. It is still a storm, but some say it is a storm of Mercury's blood, enraged, and will soon recreate itself into evil Mercury. No matter what will occur, Jupiter was rewarded with his apprehension to put his finesse on this planet Jupiter, which he surely did. He was pleased, too, that he did this great deed for the future. But for his fight and evil tone, they gave Mercury a small, dead planet. The one we know today as the closest planet from our sun. Jupiter has kept his place as High Ruler and lived in a great life where he was able to rule a good life among his people. No one ever did find out that Jupiter was on Jupiter. They just knew that it was later discovered by Jupiter. Later on, people knew that more and more about Jupiter. The more they would abstruse the truth, the less they would be well-educated of the legend. The Great Red Spot is what we call it. It's getting larger and larger as life goes by. This means that someday Mercury will come back for Jupiter.